Sometimes the most powerful people in the world are the ones you never recognize. They walk among ordinary folks, blending in without a trace of their true identity. That's exactly how one man lived, rich enough to own private jets, yet he chose to travel unnoticed like everyone else. But on one particular flight, a single moment of arrogance from a passenger, and a crew blinded by bias, turned the entire cabin into a stage of tension. What happened inside those few minutes would change every life on board, but no one saw it coming. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you are watching from today and what time you are currently watching this video. If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more. The airport in Dallas buzzed with its usual chaos. Travelers rushed through security checks, children cried as their parents struggled with strollers, and business people walked quickly while glued to their phones. Among them was a man who looked no different from the rest. He wore simple jeans, a plain hoodie, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. A black backpack hung from one shoulder, and his sneakers looked well-worn. He moved with calm steps, not trying to draw attention. His name was Marcus Hill. To anyone watching, he was just another passenger. No one could guess that Marcus was one of the richest men in America. He had built a technology empire quietly and preferred to keep his wealth private. Marcus disliked the spotlight. He hated flashy clothes and bodyguards trailing behind him. Today, he wanted to board his flight like every other person, sit in his first-class seat, and enjoy a peaceful trip to New York. Marcus passed through the gate with his boarding pass, nodding politely to the flight attendant who scanned it. He didn't notice the sharp eyes of a woman standing nearby, a woman who carried herself with the kind of entitlement that demanded attention. Her name was Deborah Stanton, though many people behind her back would have called her a Karen. She wore an expensive pearl necklace, a sharp white blazer, and had her blonde hair styled perfectly. She held her purse in one hand and her phone in the other, her lips pursed as though everything around her was beneath her standards. Deborah was used to getting her way. She had made a life out of complaining until managers bent rules for her, demanding respect she hadn't earned and treating others like servants. She too was flying to New York, and her first-class ticket felt like proof of her superiority. Marcus found his seat, 3A, near the window in the VIP section of first class. He slid into it quietly, setting his backpack under the seat in front of him. He leaned his head against the side, ready to rest. The plane filled up slowly, the sound of luggage being shoved into overhead bins echoing through the cabin. Flight attendants moved briskly, helping passengers settle in. That was when Deborah appeared. She stopped at Marcus's row, her face tightening the second she saw him sitting there. She glanced at her ticket, then at Marcus, and immediately frowned. "Excuse me," she said loudly, her voice sharp enough for the nearby passengers to hear. "You're in my seat." Marcus lifted his cap slightly and looked at her, calm and polite. "This is 3A, he said, showing his boarding pass. "That's what my ticket says." Deborah leaned closer, narrowing her eyes at him. "No, this is my seat. I paid for this seat. Are you sure you're not in economy by mistake?" The tone in her voice carried more than just doubt. It carried accusation. Other passengers nearby began to glance over, sensing tension. Marcus remained steady. "This is definitely my seat," he repeated. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He just stayed calm. But Deborah's pride couldn't handle it. She turned quickly to a flight attendant who was adjusting luggage in the overhead bin. "Excuse me," she snapped, waving her ticket dramatically. "There's a mistake here. This man is in my seat." The attendant, a young woman named Claire, looked at the ticket Deborah thrust into her hand. She compared it with Marcus's ticket. Both clearly read 3A. For a moment, Claire hesitated. Deborah seized the moment to lean closer and whisper, though loud enough for Marcus to hear. "I'm sure he made a mistake. Maybe he just doesn't belong here." Her eyes scanned him with judgment, from his hoodie to his worn shoes. Claire's face tightened, caught between fairness and the demanding glare of Deborah. She turned toward Marcus. "Sir, may I see your ticket again?" Marcus calmly handed it over. Claire checked, nodded slightly, but then glanced nervously at Deborah. The atmosphere in the cabin thickened. Deborah's posture screamed impatience, while Marcus's silence carried its own quiet weight. "I understand both of you have 3A, Claire finally said. "Let me check with the captain and see how we can resolve this." But Deborah wasn't having it. She crossed her arms and spoke loudly enough for the entire row to hear. "Why are we wasting time? Look at him. He's clearly not first-class material. Move him so I can sit down." The words cut through the air like a knife. A few passengers gasped softly. Marcus didn't react outwardly, but his jaw tightened under the shadow of his cap. Claire shifted uncomfortably. Instead of standing her ground, she leaned toward Marcus with a lowered voice. "Sir, would you mind moving just for now until we sort this out?" Marcus looked up at her, calm but firm. "This is my seat." Deborah scoffed loudly. "Unbelievable. This is why airlines need better standards." The tension spread like fire. Other passengers were now watching openly, whispering among themselves. A second flight attendant approached, then a third, each drawn in by the commotion. Marcus sat still, unmoving. His patience was clear, but so was his refusal to be pushed around. He knew who he was. What Deborah didn't know, and what the crew clearly hadn't imagined, was that this quiet man in simple clothes had the power to make decisions that could change their lives forever. And yet, in that moment, they treated him like he was nothing. The second flight attendant, older and sterner, looked directly at Marcus. "Sir, we'll need you to move to another seat so this passenger can take hers. We can arrange something for you in business class." The words dropped like a stone in water. Deborah's smirk spread slowly across her face, satisfied with the outcome. Marcus lowered his eyes, exhaled slowly, and picked up his backpack. He rose to his feet. The air in the cabin shifted. Passengers watched silently, some shaking their heads, others too nervous to say anything. As Marcus stepped into the aisle, Deborah slid into the seat he had just left, crossing her legs triumphantly. The attendants avoided Marcus's eyes, guiding him toward the back. But none of them knew that every step Marcus took was another tick of a clock counting down to a moment they would all regret. The plane hadn't even left the ground, but the weight of what just happened would follow them into the skies, and end very badly. The aisle of the plane was tight as Marcus followed the flight attendant toward the back. Passengers shifted in their seats, pretending not to stare, but their eyes followed him. A few whispered to one another. Some felt uneasy about what they had just witnessed, but no one spoke up. Marcus kept his steps steady, his face calm, though inside his chest the air felt heavier. He wasn't angry, not yet. What he felt was disappointment, the kind that sank into his bones. He had seen situations like this before, but each time it stung the same way. Claire, the young flight attendant, tried to soften the moment with a polite voice. "We'll place you in business class, sir. It's still a comfortable seat. We'll make sure you're okay." Marcus didn't reply. He just nodded once, his eyes fixed ahead. They reached an empty seat in business class. Claire gestured to it with a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. Marcus sat down quietly, slipping his backpack under the seat again. The seat wasn't bad. It was spacious, clean, with enough room to relax. But that wasn't the point. He had paid for first class, and he had been thrown aside for someone louder, someone who carried entitlement like a shield. As he settled in, Marcus glanced around. The passengers in business class gave him curious looks, some sympathetic, some indifferent. A man across the aisle, a construction worker in dusty boots, shook his head. He muttered under his breath, "Ain't right. What they did to you." Marcus met his eyes briefly, offering a faint nod of acknowledgement. Meanwhile, back in first class, Deborah leaned back in her seat with a satisfied sigh. She pulled out her phone, already typing a message, likely bragging to someone about her victory. She waved her hand toward one of the attendants. "Can I get a glass of champagne before we take off?" The attendant nodded quickly, eager to please her. The captain's voice soon came over the intercom, announcing their departure. The plane's doors closed, and the engines hummed to life. Flight attendants moved briskly, checking seatbelts and securing the cabin. As the plane began to taxi, Marcus leaned back, closing his eyes briefly. He had no intention of making a scene. He wasn't the kind of man to shout or demand, but he never forgot moments like this. He remembered faces. He remembered actions. The plane lifted into the sky, the ground shrinking below them. Passengers settled into the rhythm of the flight. Some pulled out laptops, others opened books, and a few already dozed off. But tension lingered in the air, like a shadow no one could quite shake. Half an hour into the flight, Deborah pressed her call button. When Claire arrived, Deborah gave her a pointed look. "This seatbelt isn't comfortable. Do you have something better? Maybe a cushion or an upgrade?" Claire forced a smile. "This is the highest class on the plane, ma'am. We can bring you an extra pillow if you'd like." Deborah sighed dramatically, making sure nearby passengers noticed. "Fine, but next time, tell your company to fix these seats. For the price I paid, I expect more." Claire returned with the pillow, setting it gently for Deborah. Deborah barely acknowledged her before turning her attention back to her phone. In business class, Marcus watched quietly as flight attendants served meals. His tray came with chicken, rice, and a roll of bread. He ate slowly, his mind elsewhere. The man across the aisle leaned over slightly. "They treated you wrong up there," he said in a low voice. "If I were you, I'd raise hell." Marcus gave a faint smile. Sometimes raising hell doesn't change anything. People show you who they are when they think you can't fight back. The man frowned, puzzled by Marcus's calmness. "Still ain't fair." Marcus didn't answer. He just went back to his meal. Further up the cabin, Deborah continued her stream of demands. She asked for more champagne. She requested her meal to be reheated because it wasn't hot enough. She even snapped her fingers once to get the attention of an attendant passing by. Each time, the attendants responded quickly, trying to avoid conflict. But passengers noticed. Some rolled their eyes. Some whispered quietly to each other. One woman leaned over to her husband and muttered, "She thinks she owns the plane." The attendants themselves began to feel the weight of her presence. Their smiles grew tighter, their voices more forced. But none of them dared to challenge her, not after what had happened with Marcus. An hour into the flight, the plane hit turbulence. The cabin lights flickered slightly, and the plane shook just enough to make passengers grip their armrests. Deborah immediately pressed her call button again. "This is ridiculous," she snapped when Claire arrived. "Do something about this. I didn't pay for a bumpy ride." Claire blinked, unsure how to respond. "Ma'am, turbulence is natural during flights. The captain will steer us through it." Deborah huffed loudly, throwing her hands in the air. "Unacceptable. If this continues, I will demand compensation." Passengers nearby stifled laughs at the absurdity, but Deborah remained blind to their reactions. She sat back, arms crossed, as though the universe itself had wronged her. Marcus, however, kept calm through the turbulence. His hands rested lightly on the armrest, his breathing steady. He glanced toward the front of the cabin, watching how the attendants rushed around Deborah like nervous bees. He said nothing, but in his silence, there was a kind of quiet power. He was watching, waiting, measuring every action. The turbulence passed, and the plane leveled again. Passengers relaxed, conversations resumed, and the hum of the engines filled the cabin once more. But the atmosphere had already shifted. People had seen the way Marcus had been treated. They had seen how Deborah demanded and demeaned. And though no one spoke of it openly, the memory of those moments clung to the air. Marcus leaned back, closing his eyes once more. In his mind, he replayed every detail, the way Deborah had looked at him, the way the attendants had bowed to her demands, the way he had been asked to move despite having the right seat. He wasn't angry, but he was calculating. 5 minutes. That's all it would take, he thought. 5 minutes to change everything. But for now, he remained silent, hidden beneath his cap, blending into the crowd. No one knew who he really was. No one suspected the weight of the decision he carried. And as the flight continued smoothly toward New York, the clock ticked closer to the moment when silence would break and consequences would fall like thunder. The flight had settled into a quiet rhythm. The hum of the engines mixed with the occasional clink of glasses from the beverage cart. Most passengers had relaxed into their seats, either watching movies, reading, or dozing off. But the calm was only on the surface. Underneath, tension still lingered, like a storm waiting to break. Marcus sat silently in his business class seat, his cap still pulled low. His hands rested on his lap, but his mind was far from resting. He had been observing carefully the way the attendants bent over backward for Deborah, the way passengers exchanged glances, the way silence kept people from speaking up. To him, this was more than a flight. It was a picture of how people treated others when they thought no one important was watching. He leaned back, letting out a slow breath. He could have ended the entire situation right there. He had the means, the influence, the power to make one phone call that would shake the airline. But Marcus didn't act quickly. He believed in timing. Timing was everything. In first class, Deborah was far from quiet. She had grown louder with each glass of champagne, her voice carrying across the cabin. "Honestly," she said to no one in particular, "service on these flights just keeps going downhill. When I flew last year to Paris, I had a private cabin. Here, I feel like I'm being shoved in with common people." Her words carried, and a man in the row behind her muttered, "Lady, you're not as special as you think." Deborah turned, glaring. "Excuse me? I'll have you know I paid top dollar for this seat. If you don't like it, maybe you should stay in economy where you belong." The man shook his head, muttering again, "Unbelievable." The attendants hurried forward, trying to calm things before it escalated. They apologized to Deborah, promising to make her experience better, offering more drinks and snacks. Deborah smirked, leaning back as if she had won yet another battle. Marcus watched this unfold from his seat. He noticed the passengers shifting uncomfortably, noticed the attendants growing more flustered. He noticed Deborah's pride growing with every demand. Suddenly, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're expecting a stretch of rough air ahead. Please fasten your seatbelts and remain seated until the light is turned off." The seatbelt signs blinked on. Passengers clicked their belts in place. The attendants rushed to secure the cabin, moving quickly between rows. Deborah, however, pressed her button again. Claire appeared at her side, slightly out of breath. "Yes, ma'am." Deborah pointed at her empty champagne glass. "Refill this before the turbulence starts." "Ma'am, the captain requested everyone be seated," Claire explained carefully. "It's not safe right now." Deborah narrowed her eyes. "Do I look like I care about your safety instructions? I paid for this seat, and I want what I paid for. Give me another drink." Claire hesitated, torn between her training and Deborah's glare. The pause was too long. Deborah leaned closer, her voice low but sharp. "Do your job, or I'll have you reported." Claire swallowed, nodded quickly, and rushed to the galley. From his seat, Marcus noticed the exchange. His eyes narrowed slightly. He wasn't surprised, but each detail added weight to what he was already carrying in his mind. The turbulence hit. The plane jolted suddenly, rattling trays and sending a few drinks spilling on a passenger's laps. Deborah squealed, clutching her glass tightly to avoid spilling what was left in it. People gasped, some holding onto their armrests, others bowing their heads. The plane steadied, but the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted once again. Passengers were on edge, already irritated by Deborah's antics, and now they had been shaken by the turbulence. Claire returned with the champagne, carefully pouring it into Deborah's glass despite the bumps. Deborah smirked, raising it like a trophy. Finally, at least someone listens. The man behind her muttered again, louder this time. Someone needs to throw her off this plane. A few passengers chuckled under their breath, but none dared to laugh openly. The attendants looked exhausted already, their smiles stretched thin. Marcus studied each of their faces carefully. He noticed the fear of losing their jobs, the hesitation to stand up against someone who looked entitled, the desperate need to keep the peace even at the cost of fairness. An hour passed. The plane grew quiet again. Lights dimmed as many passengers settled in for rest. Deborah leaned back, finally quiet, scrolling on her phone. Marcus pulled out a small notebook from his backpack. He flipped it open, the pages filled with neat handwriting. He began jotting down small notes, his pen moving quickly across the paper. Observations, names, times. His handwriting was sharp and precise, each line deliberate. The man across the aisle leaned slightly, curious. "What are you writing there?" Marcus glanced at him briefly, then closed the notebook gently. "Just taking notes," he replied simply. The man nodded, though he seemed puzzled. He went back to his magazine, leaving Marcus alone. Marcus slipped the notebook back into his bag and leaned against the headrest. His mind was sharp, his patience unbroken. He had been underestimated before. He had been judged by his clothes, by his quietness, by his refusal to flash wealth. And each time, people learned the truth too late. This flight would be no different. At the front of the plane, Deborah pressed her button again. Claire appeared, visibly tired. "What now?" Claire asked, still trying to sound polite. Deborah frowned. "This blanket is too thin. Do you have something warmer?" Claire shook her head. "I'm sorry, ma'am. That's the standard blanket." Deborah rolled her eyes dramatically. "Useless. Just useless." She shoved the blanket away and crossed her arms. Claire stood there for a moment, biting her lip, before forcing another smile and stepping away. Marcus opened his eyes, watching. His mind ticked like a clock. The way the crew bent, the way passengers stayed silent, the way Deborah thrived in chaos. It was all coming together. 5 minutes. That phrase echoed in his thoughts again. Just 5 minutes could change the course of everything happening here. But not yet. Timing mattered. And so he waited, as the flight carried on, as whispers grew louder, as tempers tightened, and as silence thickened the air like a storm cloud no one could see yet. The cabin lights dimmed further as the flight entered the late-night stretch. Most passengers tried to settle into sleep. Some had pulled on masks over their faces, while others tucked themselves under the thin airline blankets. The soft hum of the engines filled the silence, broken only by the occasional clink of ice and glasses. But for Marcus, sleep was far away. He leaned slightly into the aisle, eyes half closed but observant. He had a quiet strength about him, the kind that didn't need loud words to make itself known. Every detail of the flight, the expressions of the crew, the whispers of the passengers, the entitled commands of Deborah, etched itself deeper into his mind. Deborah herself showed no sign of quieting down. Even though most people were trying to rest, she tapped her call button once more. Claire arrived with a weary smile, her voice soft so she wouldn't disturb other passengers. "Yes, ma'am." Deborah pointed to her pillow. "This is too flat. Do you have anything better? I can't be expected to sleep on something this cheap." Claire shook her head gently. "I'm afraid that's the only type we carry on board." Deborah sighed dramatically, loud enough for everyone in the front row to hear. "Unbelievable. I can't believe the money I spent for this. I deserve better." A man too rose ahead, groaned, and muttered, "Lady, we're all tired. Can you just let people rest?" Deborah shot him a sharp look. "Excuse me? Do not speak to me that way. I paid for this experience, and if it's not up to my standards, I will say so." The man shook his head and turned away, deciding it wasn't worth the fight. But the ripple of irritation spread through first class. Passengers shifted, whispered, exchanged glances. Everyone knew what was happening, but no one wanted to be the one to step in. Meanwhile, Marcus continued to observe quietly. His face remained calm, but his eyes sharpened at every interaction. He noticed how Claire bit her lip as she walked back to the galley. He noticed how the other attendants avoided lingering near Deborah. He noticed how passengers were restless, their patience thin. The plane shook lightly again, another patch of turbulence. Gasps echoed through the cabin as cups rattled and overhead bins creaked. Deborah yelped, clutching her glass again. Then, as the plane steadied, she pressed her button once more. Another attendant, a tall man named Stephen, approached this time. "Yes, ma'am." Deborah crossed her arms. "I need to speak to the captain." This turbulence is unacceptable. Stephen blinked, unsure if he had heard her correctly. Ma'am, turbulence is normal in air travel. The captain is busy navigating the aircraft. Deborah's voice rose, sharp enough for the entire cabin to hear. Don't tell me what's normal. I want to speak to the captain. Right now. Passengers groaned. Someone whispered, she's insane. Another added, we'll never get through this flight with her. Stephen forced a polite smile. Ma'am, I cannot bring the captain out of the cockpit. It's against regulations. Deborah slammed her hand on the armrest. Unacceptable. You people don't understand who you're dealing with. Her words cut through the air. Some passengers looked away uncomfortably. Others rolled their eyes. But Marcus didn't move. He simply shifted slightly, leaning back as if storing those exact words in his memory. Stephen excused himself quickly, returning to the galley. Deborah sat back, seething, muttering under her breath about standards and incompetence. Half an hour passed. Most of the passengers tried to ignore her. But then another spark lit the fire. An elderly woman in first class pressed her button. She spoke softly when an attendant arrived. Excuse me, dear, could I have some water? Before the attendant could respond, Deborah cut in. Oh no, I was here first. I need my request handled before anyone else. The elderly woman looked startled. I wasn't trying to. Deborah waved a dismissive hand. Please, I've been waiting all night. If they can't handle my needs, they shouldn't be wasting time on other passengers. The elderly woman flushed red, looking down at her lap. The attendant hesitated, torn. She handed water to the elderly woman anyway, and Deborah's glare burned like fire. Unbelievable, Deborah muttered loudly. Favoritism now? Is that what this airline does? Marcus's jaw tightened. He watched the elderly woman sip her water with trembling hands, clearly shaken by the exchange. Marcus felt the weight of the moment press harder. He didn't move, but his silence spoke louder than words. The passengers around Deborah began to stir. A young man across the aisle whispered harshly, Lady, leave her alone. She just asked for water. Deborah whipped around, glaring at him. Stay out of this. You don't know who I am. The young man didn't back down. I don't care who you are. You're rude. You've been rude this whole flight. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the cabin. Deborah's face reddened. She looked around, suddenly realizing that not everyone was on her side anymore. For the first time, a crack showed in her shield of arrogance. The attendants rushed in, trying to calm the rising voices. Please, everyone, let's keep things peaceful. We still have hours left in the flight. But the damage was done. Deborah's entitlement had turned the entire cabin against her. In business class, Marcus leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. His mind ticked steadily. Each new event added fuel to the fire. He wasn't angry at the passengers who stayed quiet. He understood why they did. It wasn't their fight. But he was angry at the crew. Not because they were afraid, but because they had chosen convenience over fairness. And that, Marcus thought, was something he could never ignore. The rest of the cabin grew quieter again, but the tension didn't fade. It hung thick like smoke after fire. Deborah sipped her drink, glaring at anyone who dared look her way. The attendants kept their distance, trying to avoid more trouble. The passengers exchanged uneasy looks, each silently wondering how much worse the situation could get. Marcus leaned back again, his cap hiding his eyes. He looked like a man resting, but inside, every detail was locked in place. He didn't need to speak, not yet. But when he did, the flight would never be the same. The plane pushed through the night sky, miles above the earth. Outside the windows, darkness stretched endlessly, broken only by the faint twinkle of stars. Inside the cabin, though, the atmosphere was far from peaceful. The earlier clash in first class still hung over everyone like a heavy curtain. Marcus sat motionless in business class, but his mind was alert. Every sound, the ding of a call button, the shuffle of an attendant, the irritated sigh of a passenger, stood out to him. He knew patterns. He understood pressure, and he could see this flight unraveling thread by thread. Deborah, in her seat up front, had grown restless again. Her glass of champagne was empty, and she was annoyed that no one rushed to refill it. She pressed her button sharply, tapping her nails against the armrest as if to remind everyone she was still the most important person on the plane. Claire, the young attendant, approached quickly, her steps heavy with fatigue. Yes, ma'am. Deborah waved her empty glass. I've been waiting. Refill this. Now. Claire kept her smile, but her voice was thinner now. Of course, ma'am. I'll bring it right away. As she turned to go, Deborah added loudly, and make sure it's chilled. Last one wasn't cold enough. Passengers shifted in their seats. A woman whispered to her husband, I don't know how much more of this I can take. The husband murmured back, she's pushing everyone's patience. One more outburst, and somebody's going to snap. Claire returned moments later with another glass. Deborah snatched it without a thank you, sipping loudly before leaning back again. Her eyes scanned the cabin, daring anyone to challenge her. But challenge came sooner than she expected. The elderly woman who had asked for water earlier dropped her napkin onto the floor. When she bent to pick it up, her elbow brushed Deborah's foot. Deborah reacted instantly, jerking back as if burned. "Watch it," she snapped. "Do you know how much these shoes cost? You nearly ruined them." The elderly woman gasped. I'm so sorry. It was an accident." Deborah rolled her eyes. "Accident or not, people need to respect personal space. Some of us have standards." Gasps rippled through the cabin. The young man across the aisle leaned forward again, his patience gone. "Are you serious?" She just dropped a napkin. "You've been attacking everyone since we boarded." Deborah's face turned red. "You don't talk to me that way. Do you know who I am?" The man snapped back. "No one cares who you are." Passengers clapped softly, a few muttering words of agreement. Deborah's mouth opened in shock. Her pride stung for the first time. She looked around desperately, but the attendants stayed frozen, unsure whether to step in. Marcus watched carefully. His eyes moved from Deborah to the young man, then to the attendants, then back again. The temperature in the cabin had risen, but not because of heat. This was the kind of boiling tension that ended in mistakes. Stephen, the tall attendant, finally moved forward, raising his hands. "Please, everyone, let's lower our voices. We don't want to disturb the rest of the passengers." But the passengers weren't calming down. The young man shook his head. "You need to do something about her. She's been harassing people the whole flight, and you've let her get away with it." Murmurs of agreement spread again. Deborah scoffed, glaring at the young man. "Harassing? Don't flatter yourself. I demand service because I deserve it. If you can't handle that, maybe you're the problem." The passengers groaned in unison. The tension had now fully shifted. No one was on Deborah's side anymore. Claire stepped in beside Stephen. Her voice wavered slightly. "Ma'am, please. For the sake of everyone's comfort, can we lower the volume?" Deborah whipped her head toward her, eyes blazing. "Don't you dare lecture me. You're here to serve. Remember your place." The word struck like a slap. Claire froze, her face paling. Passengers gasped again. The young man stood halfway out of his seat, fists clenched. "That's it. I've had enough of her." His wife grabbed his arm quickly, whispering urgently, "Sit down, please. Don't make it worse." Reluctantly, he sank back into his seat, but his eyes stayed locked on Deborah. Marcus leaned back further in his seat, his fingers tapping slowly against the armrest. Every second that passed told him more about the people around him. The passengers wanted justice, but feared going too far. The crew wanted order, but chose submission. Deborah thrived because silence fed her. But silence never lasted forever. 2 hours into the flight, dinner service began. Trays clattered as attendants handed out meals row by row. The smell of chicken, pasta, and bread filled the cabin. Marcus accepted as quietly, eating slowly, his mind still sharper than his appetite. In first class, Deborah wrinkled her nose at her plate. "What is this?" "This looks disgusting." Stephen answered carefully. "It's roasted chicken with vegetables, ma'am. Or we also have pasta available." Deborah shoved the tray back at him. "Neither looks edible. Take it away, and bring me something better." Stephen hesitated. "That's all we have tonight, ma'am." Deborah's voice rose again. "Unbelievable. I paid for first class, and you're feeding me scraps? I wouldn't feed this to my dog." The cabin erupted in murmurs. A passenger shouted from the back of first class, "Then don't eat it." Another added, "Some of us are fine with our meals. Stop acting like royalty." Deborah's cheeks flushed deep red. She looked ready to fire back, but for the first time, she noticed how many eyes were staring at her with open hostility. The walls she had built around herself were cracking. Claire and Stephen exchanged nervous glances. They wanted to contain the situation, but they had already let it grow out of control. Marcus's eyes stayed steady on them. His face didn't change, but inside, his decision hardened. He knew exactly what this flight revealed. He knew what it meant, not just for Deborah, but for the crew who allowed her to trample everyone else. The flight continued. Deborah quieted slightly after the confrontation, but her scowl never faded. The passengers settled too, though unease still pulsed beneath the silence. Everyone knew it wasn't over. Marcus finished his meal and leaned back, his notebook once again in his hands. His pen moved quietly, filling the pages with sharp, deliberate strokes. Observations, names, times, words, and when he was done, he closed it gently and slipped it into his bag. His cap shadowed his eyes as he leaned into the darkness again. 5 minutes. That thought repeated in his mind once more. Just 5 minutes, and everything could change. The night dragged on as the plane cruised smoothly through the skies. Most passengers had settled into a fragile silence. But it wasn't the calm of peace. It was the kind of silence that carried unease, the kind that came after too much had already happened. In business class, Marcus sat still, almost invisible among the rows. His hood was pulled slightly forward, his face calm. To others, he looked like a man simply enduring a long flight. But inside, his thoughts were razor sharp. Every detail from earlier, the arrogance of Deborah, the weakness of the attendants, the frustration of the passengers, was fixed in his mind like ink on paper. Meanwhile, Deborah shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She had gone quiet after her outburst during dinner, but her pride had not shrunk. Her arms were crossed, her lips tight. She looked like someone plotting her next complaint. The elderly woman, too, rose away, peeked at her nervously, as though fearing another attack. The young man who had spoken up earlier leaned back with his arms crossed, still watching Deborah with cold eyes. The rest of the cabin kept stealing glances, waiting for the next explosion. It didn't take long. When the attendants began clearing dinner trays, Deborah snapped her fingers. Claire, walking past with a cart full of plates, stopped reluctantly. "Yes, ma'am." Deborah pointed at her empty tray table. "Why is my trash still here? I've been waiting." Claire's smile was forced. "I'll take it right now, ma'am." She leaned over and carefully lifted the tray. But Deborah wasn't finished. She raised her voice, drawing attention again. "This is what I mean. Slow service. Poor attention to detail. If this airline cared about its reputation, they'd hire better staff." Her words cut through the cabin. Claire froze for a second, her hands trembling slightly as she set the tray onto the cart. She turned quickly and walked away before her expression gave her away. Passengers exchanged looks again. Some shook their heads. Some whispered angrily. But still, no one moved beyond muttering. Deborah thrived on that silence. Marcus, however, didn't miss the way Claire's shoulders sagged as she pushed the cart away. He had seen that look before, employees trapped between customer demands and fear of losing their jobs. It was a system he understood too well. He tapped his finger against the armrest, deep in thought. The captain's voice came over the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent into New York. Please fasten your seatbelts and prepare for landing." Passengers straightened up, fastening belts, securing bags. Relief was in the air, relief that the long, tense flight was almost over. But Deborah wasn't finished. She pressed her button again. Stephen arrived this time, looking worn out. "Yes, ma'am." Deborah leaned forward. "I need to make a complaint. A serious one. Your staff has been unprofessional the entire flight. I want the captain informed. Immediately." Stephen kept his voice calm. "Ma'am, we're preparing for landing. The captain is focused on the approach. Once we land, you can file a complaint with customer service." Deborah's voice rose sharply. "No, I want her dressed now. I expect the captain to come to me before this plane touches the ground." Passengers groaned out loud this time. Someone muttered, "She's unbelievable." Another added, "We're just trying to land safely." But Deborah pressed on. "If I don't get proper service, I'll make sure this airline suffers for it." Marcus tilted his head slightly, listening carefully. Those words carried weight, the kind of arrogance that believed consequences never touched her. But Marcus knew better. He knew that arrogance always met a wall eventually. The plane jolted slightly as it dipped lower, heading into descent. Passengers clutched their armrests again, nervous from the bumps. Deborah squealed dramatically, grabbing her seatbelt with both hands. "This is outrageous. The turbulence, the service, everything is unacceptable," she shouted. The young man across the aisle finally snapped. "Ladies, shut up. We're all in the same plane, and you're making it worse for everyone." Several passengers clapped in agreement. The sound echoed through the cabin. Deborah's face flushed, her mouth opening and closing like she couldn't believe what had just happened. The attendants hurried down the aisle, urging everyone to stay calm for landing. But the energy in the cabin had shifted. For the first time, passengers weren't just muttering, they were openly standing against Deborah. Marcus sat back, silent, his cap shadowing his face. His lips curved slightly, not into a smile, but into something sharper. The moment was close. The plane continued its descent, the lights of New York beginning to glitter faintly below. Passengers braced themselves for the landing. Deborah crossed her arms, fuming, muttering to herself about lawsuits and complaints. But Marcus remained calm, steady, waiting. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing closer. Just 5 minutes. That's all it would take. The wheels touched down with a heavy thud, bouncing slightly before the plane steadied and rolled down the runway. Applause broke out from passengers relieved to be on the ground, but Deborah scoffed loudly. Applauding for what? Bare minimum service. Passengers ignored her now. Their patience for her had burned away. As the plane slowed and taxied to the gate, attendants moved through the cabin, checking belts and reminding passengers to remain seated. Marcus stayed still, his face calm, his hands folded neatly. But inside, every detail had clicked into place. The treatment, the silence, the arrogance, the weakness, it all formed the complete picture. He was ready. The seatbelt sign dinged off. Passengers unbuckled, standing quickly, eager to leave the tension behind. Bags were pulled from overhead bins, jackets tossed over shoulders. The cabin filled with the noise of movement and chatter. Deborah, however, stayed seated, glaring at Claire. "Don't think I'm done with you. I will be speaking to your manager the second we step off this plane." Claire's hands trembled slightly as she nodded, whispering a polite, "Yes, ma'am." Marcus finally rose from his seat. He lifted his backpack calmly, slinging it over one shoulder. He waited for the crowd to shuffle forward. His steps were steady, unhurried, his face unreadable. The aisle was full of passengers eager to escape. Deborah shoved her way into the line, muttering about how slowly people were moving. Passengers rolled their eyes but stepped aside, not wanting another argument. As Marcus approached the front of the plane, his eyes swept across the attendants. Claire avoided his gaze. Stephen looked stiff. Another attendant kept their head down. Marcus stopped briefly, adjusting his bag strap, his silence holding a weight heavier than words. And then, with one final glance, he stepped off the plane. The attendants didn't know it yet. Deborah didn't know it either. But the quiet man in the hoodie, the man they dismissed and humiliated, had just carried every detail of this flight into his mind like a loaded weapon. 5 minutes. That was all he would need. And those 5 minutes were coming soon. The tunnel leading from the jet bridge into the airport was crowded with restless passengers. People walked quickly, some dragging luggage with heavy thuds, others scrolling on their phones to catch up on messages after hours without signal. The atmosphere carried a strange mix of relief and frustration. Relief that the flight was over, frustration that the memory of it wasn't easy to shake. Marcus walked with the flow, his hood still up, his backpack secure on his shoulder. He moved quietly, unnoticed, just another tired traveler among dozens. But unlike the others, his steps carried purpose. He wasn't heading home. He wasn't rushing to baggage claim. He was observing, watching every detail, from the tense attendants at the gate to the smug smile Deborah wore as she strutted off the plane. Deborah was easy to spot. She walked ahead, head high, her expensive coat draped over one arm. Her heels clicked sharply against the airport floor as if announcing her arrival. She carried herself like the airport was her stage, and every person around her was an audience meant to admire. Several passengers trailed behind her, whispering. One muttered, "I hope she gets what's coming to her." Another shook his head, saying, "Unbelievable woman." Their voices didn't reach Deborah. She was too busy pulling out her phone, ready to call whoever she believed would listen to her complaints. At the gate desk, Claire and Stephen stood side by side, pretending to focus on helping passengers but clearly rattled. Their eyes darted nervously toward Deborah as she marched forward, already raising her voice. "Yes, I'd like to speak to your supervisor immediately," Deborah snapped, waving her phone as if it were proof of authority. This entire flight was a disgrace. "I expect compensation, and I expect it now." The gate agent behind the desk froze, caught between professionalism and dread. Deborah leaned in closer, her voice sharp enough to slice glass. "Don't waste my time. Bring me someone who actually has power." Passengers slowed down, some even stopping to watch. The scene felt like a continuation of the chaos in the air. Tension rolled through the crowd like a wave. Marcus hung back, leaning casually against a pillar, his eyes locked on everything. He didn't step forward, didn't intervene. Not yet. He was studying, memorizing, the gestures, the tones, the expressions. Everything. The airport supervisor soon arrived, a tall man in a navy jacket with a badge clipped to his chest. He wore the tired look of someone who had dealt with one too many complaints in a single day. "How can I help you, ma'am?" he asked calmly. Deborah wasted no time. She launched into her rant, her words spilling fast and loud. "Your staff is untrained. They disrespected me, ignored me, and provided the worst service I've ever seen. I demand disciplinary action. In fact, I want the crew's names, all of them. I'll be filing a formal complaint with corporate." Claire stiffened nearby, her eyes glued to the floor. Stephen clenched his jaw but said nothing. The supervisor listened, nodding slightly, his face unreadable. Passengers nearby shook their heads. A woman whispered to her husband, "She's trying to ruin their lives." Marcus adjusted his stance, pulling his hood back just slightly. For the first time, his face was partially visible in the bright airport lights. A sharp jawline, calm eyes, steady expression. Nobody recognized him yet, but soon that wouldn't matter. The supervisor finally responded. "Ma'am, we'll document your concerns. But please understand, disciplinary actions are handled through proper channels, not here at the gate." Deborah scoffed, glaring at him as though his words were an insult. "Proper channels? I know people. I don't need your channels. If I make one call, heads will roll. Believe me." Her arrogance echoed through the terminal. Some passengers audibly groaned. Others simply shook their heads in disbelief. Marcus stepped forward now, not toward Deborah, but toward a nearby vending machine. He slid $1 into the slot, pressed a button, and waited for the soda can to drop. But his eyes never left the scene. He cracked the can open, the sharp hiss of carbonation blending with Deborah's ongoing rant. Security guards soon appeared, summoned by the supervisor's call for backup. They didn't intervene aggressively, but their presence shifted the energy. Deborah, however, wasn't intimidated. She smiled coldly, lifting her phone as though dialing an invisible power. "You'll regret this," she hissed to Claire, pointing a manicured finger. "You'll regret ever crossing me." Claire swallowed hard, her lips trembling, but she kept her voice quiet. I was just doing my job, ma'am. Deborah sneered, then turned to the supervisor. You better hope I don't take this hire. Because once I do, none of you will have jobs tomorrow. Those words hung heavy in the air. Passengers whispered, shaking their heads. The security guards exchanged looks. Even the supervisor's calm expression faltered slightly. Marcus took a sip of his drink, his eyes narrowing. None of them knew how close her words were to the truth, but not in the way Deborah imagined. Because the power wasn't in her hands. It was standing quietly at the edge of the crowd, watching everything with sharp, calculating eyes. He finished the soda in one slow gulp and tossed the can neatly into a recycling bin. His posture straightened slightly. His silence carried weight. Deborah was still ranting when Marcus finally walked past her. For a brief moment, her eyes flicked to him, just long enough to register him as an ordinary man. She dismissed him instantly, too caught up in her self-importance. But Marcus noticed the flicker. He noticed everything. As he exited the gate area, he pulled his phone from his pocket. His thumb hovered over the screen. With one simple swipe, he could unlock a world she had no idea she was standing against. 5 minutes. That's all he would need. And as Deborah's voice carried behind him, loud, entitled, dripping with arrogance, Marcus knew those 5 minutes were about to begin. The hum of the airport grew louder as Marcus moved away from the gate. Rolling suitcases clicked over tiled floors, announcements echoed overhead, and the smell of fresh coffee drifted from nearby kiosks. To anyone watching, he looked like another weary traveler heading toward the exit. But beneath the calm exterior, Marcus's mind was working fast. He pulled his phone from his pocket again. The sleek black device reflected the bright lights above. He swiped the screen, typed in a short code, and the phone vibrated once in confirmation. A simple signal, invisible to everyone else, had been sent. That was all it took. Behind him, Deborah's voice still rang out, sharp and demanding. This airline is finished if I have anything to say about it. She barked at the supervisor, her finger jabbing the air like a weapon. The crew stood stiffly by the counter, silent, helpless. The passengers who lingered nearby were tired of her theatrics, but curiosity kept their eyes glued to the scene. Marcus slipped into the flow of travelers moving through the terminal. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. Every second that passed was another piece falling into place. He adjusted his hood slightly, though it had already slipped back enough to reveal more of his face. A businessman passing by gave him a second look, as if recognition stirred faintly, but the man dismissed it, too distracted by his own rush to his gate. Marcus's phone buzzed again. He glanced down quickly. A short message appeared. Understood. Action in motion. His lips pressed into a thin line. That was all the confirmation he needed. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and continued walking, weaving effortlessly through the crowd. Back at the gate, the atmosphere thickened. Deborah was relentless. She demanded the names of every crew member, threatening lawsuits, and calling her husband loudly on speakerphone so everyone could hear. Richard, listen to me, she said, her voice dripping with drama. They humiliated me. They made me look like a fool in front of an entire plane. You need to call your contacts. Heads need to roll today. Passengers groaned audibly now. Some even muttered unbelievable as they walked away. Claire stood frozen in place, hands clasped tightly in front of her. Stephen whispered something under his breath, but his clenched fists gave away his frustration. The supervisor tried again. Ma'am, please lower your voice. There are families and children around. If you'd like to file a complaint, we'll provide the forms. I don't want your forms. Deborah snapped, her face reddening. I want justice. I want them fired. Do you hear me? Fired. Her shrill tone sliced through the terminal. The children sitting near the waiting area shifted uncomfortably, their parents shaking their heads. Security stood close by, but didn't intervene, knowing that any wrong move could make the situation worse. Through it all, Marcus had already reached the escalators. He stepped on, letting it carry him down slowly toward the baggage claim. His eyes scanned the wide hall, the lines at coffee shops, the glowing arrival boards. Everything appeared ordinary, but he knew within minutes the atmosphere would change. At the bottom of the escalator, he paused by a wide glass wall overlooking the runway. Outside, baggage carts zipped back and forth under the floodlights. Planes taxied in slow, deliberate motion. The entire scene looked calm, routine. Yet Marcus's calm eyes never stopped calculating. His phone buzzed once more. Another message. Confirmation received. 5 minutes. 5 minutes. He inhaled deeply, exhaled slowly, and turned toward the carousel where bags had begun to slide onto the conveyor belt. Travelers crowded around, eyes scanning for familiar suitcases. He blended in, appearing distracted by the endless stream of luggage. But his attention remained sharp, tuned to every sound and movement around him. Upstairs, Deborah was still in full swing. She had moved from insults to outright threats. Do you know who I am? Do you have any idea the people I can call? Your entire company will regret treating me like this. Her words cracked like a whip. Yet beneath the volume of her voice, something else began to stir. The supervisor's phone buzzed, and his expression shifted slightly as he read the incoming alert. He quickly excused himself, stepping away from the counter, his face pale. Stephen noticed. "What's going on?" he whispered to Claire. "I don't know," she whispered back, her pulse quickening. The supervisor returned moments later, his voice low and urgent as he whispered something to the security guards. They exchanged tense looks, then one of them spoke quietly into his radio. Deborah, still oblivious, prattled on about her rights. "I'll make sure everyone in this terminal knows how disgraceful this airline is," she declared. But passengers were already shifting uneasily. A ripple of unease moved through the waiting area as more staff quietly gathered, whispering among themselves. The air seemed to grow heavier, charged with something none of them could quite name. Marcus stood still by the carousel, his hood now fully off. A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve nearby and whispered, "Mom, that man looks like someone from TV." The mother glanced at Marcus, blinked, then quickly hushed her son, pulling him closer. Recognition was spreading like sparks in dry grass. A businessman across the carousel tilted his head, studying Marcus carefully. His eyes widened just slightly, though he said nothing. Marcus kept his calm, his face unreadable. He knew it was only a matter of time before whispers turned into words, and words into attention. But he didn't mind. In fact, that was part of the plan. Meanwhile, upstairs, Claire finally found her voice. "Ma'am," she said softly, though her voice shook. "We did nothing to disrespect you. Please, just let us do our jobs." Deborah spun on her heel, glaring at her. "Don't you dare talk back to me. You're finished, all of you." Her words cut deep, but at that same moment, another supervisor arrived, this one wearing a badge of higher authority. He whispered urgently to the first supervisor, and both their faces tensed. Something was happening behind the scenes. Something far bigger than Deborah realized. And still, she went on, blind to the shift in the air. Marcus checked his watch. 4 minutes had passed. 1 more minute to go. The carousel spun slowly, bags sliding out one by one. People grabbed their luggage and hurried off, but Marcus stood still, calm, unmoving. His eyes flicked briefly to the far end of the hall where several suited men had appeared, walking briskly through the crowd. Their presence was quiet but powerful, commanding respect without a single word. The first man raised his hand slightly, and the others fanned out. Travelers moved aside instinctively, sensing authority. Marcus's phone buzzed one last time. A single word flashed across the screen. "Ready." He slid the phone back into his pocket, squared his shoulders, and began walking toward the suited men. The moment had arrived. Upstairs, Deborah's voice rang louder than ever. "Mark my words, this crew is done." But downstairs, the real shift was about to begin. The air inside the airport terminal had shifted. It was no longer just the buzz of travelers and announcements. There was tension, thick, electric, and impossible to ignore. Passengers sensed it, even if they couldn't name it. At the baggage claim, Marcus moved with quiet certainty. His hood was completely off now, his face exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights. The men in tailored suits approached with swift, deliberate steps. They didn't jostle, they didn't shout, they carried themselves with the kind of presence that instantly parted the crowd. The businessman who had been watching Marcus whispered to his wife, "That's him. I swear that's him." His wife's eyes widened. She clutched her purse tighter, whispering back, "Are you sure?" But Marcus gave no attention to the whispers spreading like wildfire. His eyes locked on the lead man in the group of suits, a tall figure with silver-rimmed glasses and a calm, steady expression. "Sir," the man said respectfully, bowing his head slightly as Marcus approached. Marcus gave a simple nod. "Is everything prepared?" "Yes, sir, every detail." The men moved around him, forming a subtle shield. Their polished shoes clicked softly against the marble floor, their eyes scanning every corner of the hall. They weren't ordinary assistants. They were his team, his people, the backbone of a billion-dollar empire hidden beneath his plain hoodie and jeans. Upstairs, Deborah was still in full storm mode. Her shrill voice echoed as she pointed toward the crew. "You think you can just embarrass me? You'll regret this for the rest of your lives. My husband will make sure of it." But her performance was beginning to lose its grip. Several passengers had already pulled out their phones, recording every word. Some whispered about how unfair the entire incident had been. Others simply shook their heads, disgusted by her arrogance. Then, suddenly, the main supervisor received a call. His phone vibrated in his palm. He glanced at the screen, his face instantly paling. He picked it up quickly. "Yes. Yes, sir. Understood," he stammered. When he ended the call, his hands trembled slightly. He turned to his colleague and whispered urgently, "It's him. It's Marcus King." The name carried weight, like a spark thrown into dry brush. The second supervisor blinked in shock. "Marcus King? The tech billionaire?" "Yes. The one Forbes called the Ghost CEO last year. He's here." He was the one she had removed. Their eyes darted toward Deborah, who still ranted without pause. The realization sank in like a stone in water. This wasn't just an ordinary passenger they had wronged. This was one of the wealthiest men in the country, a man whose companies controlled technologies the world relied on daily. And he had been humiliated at their gate. Deborah, unaware of the storm unraveling around her, smirked as she saw the crew trembling. "See? They're scared now," she sneered. "That's what happens when you cross me." But the crew wasn't trembling because of her. Downstairs, Marcus walked with his men toward a private elevator tucked discreetly near the wall. Security guards, now fully aware of who he was, stood straighter and moved aside, some bowing their heads in quiet respect. Travelers who recognized him whispered louder now, their phones snapping quick pictures. "That's Marcus King, the billionaire? What's he doing here dressed like that?" The murmurs grew. Marcus ignored them all. His mind replayed the humiliation of being forced out of his rightful seat, treated like he didn't belong. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't argued, hadn't flexed his power. But that moment had been enough. And now, the response was already in motion. Inside the elevator, the suited man with silver glasses leaned close. "Sir, the airline's board has been alerted. Executives are calling in from across the country. Orders are being carried out as we speak." Marcus's jaw tightened slightly. Good. They need to understand. The elevator doors closed, sealing him and his men inside. Back upstairs, the gate's supervisor's phone rang again. His hand shook as he answered. Yes, I understand." He swallowed hard. Immediately, when he hung up, his face was as pale as paper. He turned to Deborah, who smirked triumphantly, expecting to hear her demands had been met. Instead, the supervisor's voice was steady, though his hand shook. "Ma'am, you need to stop speaking right now." Deborah blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me? Do you know who I am?" "Yes," the supervisor said firmly. "And we now know who he is." Confusion flickered across her face. "What are you talking about?" Before she could press further, an announcement crackled over the intercom, heard not only at the gate but across the terminal. "Attention! All ground and flight crew members associated with Flight 728 are hereby relieved of duty effective immediately. Please report to the main office for debriefing." The words hit like thunder. Gasps spread through the crowd. Claire staggered back, her heart pounding. Stephen's jaw fell open. The entire crew stared at one another, stunned. "What?" Claire whispered, her voice breaking. Passengers erupted in whispers, pulling out phones to record the shocking moment. Deborah froze, her confidence cracking as she looked around. "Wait, what's going on? Why are you all reacting like this?" The supervisor finally looked her in the eye. "Ma'am, the man you had removed from his seat wasn't just a passenger. He owns more than you can imagine, and he doesn't tolerate being treated like trash." Deborah's smirk disappeared. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time all evening, she looked small, her bravado stripped away by the weight of reality. Claire and Stephen stood silently, their uniforms suddenly heavier on their shoulders. They had been humiliated, threatened, and pushed to the edge, but now the tables had turned in a way no one could have predicted. Some passengers cheered under their breath. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Phones captured every second, knowing this moment would spread across the internet within hours. Downstairs, Marcus stepped out of the private elevator into a sleek black SUV waiting just outside the terminal. The suited men flanked him as he slid into the back seat. "Everything's set," one of them confirmed. Marcus leaned back, his eyes narrowing slightly as the vehicle pulled away from the curb. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to make a scene. Power didn't require noise. 5 minutes after Deborah had screamed for the crew to be fired, the order had been given. Only it wasn't Deborah who decided, it was Marcus. The man she had mocked, underestimated, and dismissed. The crew hadn't just lost their posts. The airline itself was about to feel the full weight of his response. And Deborah, standing frozen at the gate, finally realized she had set into motion a storm far bigger than herself. The kind of storm that money couldn't buy her out of. If you like this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Also, in order to strengthen our community, let us know in the comments where you are watching from and what time you are currently watching this video.